I knew buying a house with a natural pond was going to change my life, but I never imagined it would turn into a legal nightmare involving the Homeowners Association, environmental law, and a woman named Patricia who seemed determined to make my existence miserable. My name is Marcus O'Brien, and I'm a 34-year-old software developer who works remotely. When I found the property in Asheville, North Carolina, it felt like fate. The house itself was modest, a 3-bedroom ranch with decent bones, but the real selling point was the acre of land behind it, featuring a gorgeous half-acre pond fed by natural springs. The water was crystal clear, home to frogs, dragonflies, and the occasional heron that would stop by for breakfast. It was my slice of paradise in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The trouble started 3 months after I moved in, right around early June when the weather started getting consistently warm. I'd been working from my back deck, enjoying my coffee and the view of sunlight dancing across the water, when I noticed Patricia Hendricks marching across my lawn like she owned the place. Patricia was the HOA president, a title she wore like a crown. She was in her late 50s, with that specific haircut that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager," and an expression that suggested she'd been sucking on lemons since birth. "Marcus," she called out, not even bothering with a greeting. "We need to discuss your pond situation." I set down my coffee mug and walked to the edge of the deck. "What situation would that be, Patricia?" "Don't play dumb with me. There's algae growing along the edges. It's unsightly, and frankly, it's bringing down property values in our community." She stood there with her hands on her hips, wearing a pressed white polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on it. I looked at the pond. Yes, there was some natural algae growth along the shallow edges where the sun hit hardest, but it was completely normal for a natural body of water. "Patricia, that's just part of having a natural pond. It's not hurting anything. In fact, it's part of the ecosystem. The tadpoles feed on it." Her face pinched like I'd just suggested she eat the algae herself. "I don't care about tadpoles. The HOA Aesthetic Committee has determined that it needs to be addressed immediately. You have 1 week to clear it up or we'll be forced to take action." Take action? What does that even mean? And since when does the HOA have jurisdiction over natural water features on private property? I could feel my blood pressure rising. I'd read the HOA covenants before buying the house, and nowhere did it mention anything about natural ponds. "Everything within the boundaries of Pine Valley Estates falls under HOA purview, Mr. O'Brien. I suggest you familiarize yourself with the bylaws." She turned on her heel and marched back across my lawn, leaving footprints in the grass I'd just fertilized. I spent the rest of that afternoon digging through the HOA documents. She was wrong. The covenants specifically mentioned maintained landscaping, exterior paint colors, and fence heights, but nothing about naturally occurring water features. I fired off an email to the HOA board explaining this, citing the exact sections of the covenants, and thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The following Tuesday, I was on a video call with a client when I heard a vehicle pull into my driveway. I glanced out the window and saw Patricia's white Lexus SUV, and my stomach immediately knotted. I wrapped up the call as quickly as possible and went outside. Patricia was standing at the edge of my pond with 2 large plastic containers at her feet. She was wearing rubber gloves and had what looked like a measuring cup in her hand. "What are you doing?" I jogged across the lawn, genuine alarm flooding through me. "The HOA is taking care of the algae problem since you refused to address it yourself," she said matter-of-factly. "This is a professional-grade algaecide. 2 treatments should clear everything right up." "Don't you dare put anything in my pond." I moved to block her, but she'd already scooped up a cup of bright blue liquid from one of the containers. "Patricia, you can't just dump chemicals in someone's private water feature." "It's for the good of the community," she said, and before I could stop her, she tossed the cup's contents into the pond. The blue liquid spread across the surface like an oil slick. I felt rage unlike anything I'd experienced before. "What the hell is wrong with you? Do you have any idea what you might have just done to the ecosystem? There are frogs in there, fish, aquatic plants." "Oh, please. It's just a little algae treatment. Stop being so dramatic." She bent down to refill the cup. I pulled out my phone. "If you put 1 more drop of that in my pond, I'm calling the police." She actually laughed. "For what?" Maintaining community standards? Go ahead, Marcus. Call them. I'm sure they have better things to do than respond to your hysterics. She dumped another cup into the water. I dialed 911, my hands shaking. When the dispatcher answered, I explained that someone was trespassing on my property and contaminating my pond with chemicals against my will. They said they'd send an officer. Patricia dumped 3 more cups of the algicide before she seemed satisfied. There, that should take care of it. You'll see results in about 48 hours. The HOA will bill you for the service. She picked up her containers, stripped off her gloves, and headed back to her SUV. You're insane, I called after her, and you're going to pay for whatever damage you've caused. She didn't even look back. Her SUV kicked up gravel as she pulled out of my driveway. Officer Ramirez arrived about 15 minutes later. He was a stocky guy in his 40s with a sympathetic expression that I immediately appreciated. I explained the situation, showing him the pond where the blue chemical was still visible on the surface, now mixing with the water and creating an eerie aquamarine color in certain spots. Did she have your permission to be on your property? He asked, taking notes. Absolutely not. She showed up uninvited, and when I told her not to put anything in the pond, she did it anyway, multiple times. I have no idea what's in that chemical or what it's going to do to the wildlife. Officer Ramirez walked the perimeter of the pond, examining it. I'm going to file a report for trespassing and property damage. You should also contact the county environmental office. If she dumped chemicals into a natural water source without proper permits or knowledge of what's feeding that pond, there could be serious environmental violations. That last part hit me. I hadn't really thought about where the water in my pond came from, beyond knowing it was spring-fed. What do you mean, what's feeding it? Springs in this area are usually connected to the larger aquifer system. The county environmental office will know more. But if this pond is part of a watershed or aquifer recharge area, what she did could be a much bigger problem than just trespassing. He handed me a business card. Here's the number for the county environmental services. Give them a call first thing in the morning. After Officer Ramirez left, I spent the rest of the evening researching the property. The deed mentioned the pond, but didn't provide much detail about its water source. I found the county GIS mapping system online and located my property. The pond showed up on the map, and there were some notations I didn't fully understand. I made a note to call environmental services as soon as they opened. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every hour or so, I'd go out to the deck with a flashlight and check on the pond. The chemical smell was noticeable now, a sharp chlorine-like odor that definitely wasn't natural. By morning, I saw the first casualty, a large bullfrog floating belly up near the bank. My heart sank. At 8 o'clock sharp, I called the Buncombe County Environmental Services office. The receptionist transferred me to a specialist named David Chen. I explained the situation, telling him about the HOA president dumping algicide into my pond without permission. Give me your address, he said, his tone immediately serious. I rattled it off and I heard him typing. There was a long pause. Mr. O'Brien, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't let anyone else near that pond. Don't let any animals drink from it. I'm sending a team out immediately. Why? What's wrong? Your pond isn't just a decorative water feature. According to our records, it's a primary surface expression of the Oak Creek Aquifer. That aquifer supplies drinking water to approximately 15,000 residents in your area, including 3 schools and a hospital. If someone contaminated it with chemicals, we have a potential public health emergency. My blood ran cold. Oh my God. We'll be there within an hour. In the meantime, if you have any information about what specific chemical was used, that would be extremely helpful. I didn't have the containers, but I remembered Patricia had mentioned it was professional-grade algicide. I told him that, and he made a sound that might have been a curse word cut short. We'll test the water as soon as we arrive. Do not touch the water yourself, Mr. O'Brien. Some of these algicides contain copper sulfate or other compounds that can be toxic. The hour wait felt like an eternity. I took photos of the dead frog and the discolored water. I also called my insurance company to report what had happened, and they advised me to document everything and said they'd open a claim. The county environmental team arrived in 2 vehicles. David Chen was a thin man in his 30s wearing a polo shirt with the county logo. He had 2 technicians with him, both carrying equipment cases. They immediately got to work taking water samples from multiple points around the pond, testing pH levels, and setting up what David explained was a portable testing station. "How long has it been since the chemical was introduced?" he asked me. "About 18 hours. She dumped it yesterday afternoon around 3 o'clock. "And you have no idea what specific product she used?" "No, but I know who she bought it from, or at least, I know her. She's the HOA president. Her name is Patricia Hendricks." David pulled out his phone. "I need her contact information. We need to know exactly what was used and in what quantities." I gave him Patricia's phone number and email, both of which were listed on the HOA website. One of the technicians called out something about copper levels being elevated, and David jogged over to check the readings. After about 20 minutes, David came back to where I was standing on the deck. His expression was grim. "Mr. O'Brien, the water contains dangerously high levels of copper sulfate, along with traces of other compounds we're still identifying. This is bad. The concentration is high enough that it's almost certainly going to reach the aquifer. We're implementing emergency protocols right now." "What does that mean?" "It means we're contacting the water authority to begin testing at all downstream access points. We may need to issue a do not drink advisory for parts of the county until we can determine the extent of the contamination. We're also going to need to remediate this pond, which will involve removing contaminated water and substrate." My head was spinning. "How much is that going to cost?" "That's not your concern right now. This is an environmental incident, and the responsible party will be held liable. I'm going to need you to provide a detailed statement about what happened, and we'll be contacting Ms. Hendricks." He paused. "I should tell you, what she did potentially violates several state and federal environmental laws. The penalties can be severe." While the environmental team worked, I called my lawyer, an attorney named Beth Rodriguez, who'd handled my house closing. I explained the situation, and she let out a low whistle. "Marcus, this is way beyond typical HOA overreach. This is criminal environmental damage and potentially reckless endangerment if that aquifer supplies drinking water. You need to file a civil suit against both Patricia Hendricks personally and the HOA, and you need to cooperate fully with the county and state environmental agencies." She paused. "I'm going to refer you to someone who specializes in environmental law. Her name is Amanda Vincent. I'll send you her contact information." Amanda Vincent called me within 30 minutes. She was crisp and professional, asking pointed questions about the timeline of events, what warnings I'd given Patricia, and what documentation I had. I sent her the photos, the police report number, and the email exchanges with Patricia about the algae. "This is one of the most clear-cut cases of environmental damage I've seen," Amanda said. "The fact that she did this after you explicitly told her not to, on your private property, and with a contaminant that's now threatening public drinking water, this is going to have serious consequences. I'm taking your case, and I'm going to file an emergency restraining order against Patricia Hendricks and the HOA to prevent any further actions on your property." By late afternoon, my quiet home had become a circus. The county environmental team had expanded to 6 people. A truck from the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality arrived. A water authority supervisor showed up. News crews appeared after someone apparently tipped them off, and suddenly I had reporters at the end of my driveway asking about the aquifer poisoning incident. David Chen gave a statement to the press explaining that a private pond that feeds the Oak Creek aquifer had been contaminated with chemicals, and that they were assessing the extent of the problem. He didn't name Patricia, but he did say that an individual had introduced the contaminant without authorization and that the investigation was ongoing. My phone rang. It was Patricia. "What the hell have you done?" she screeched before I could even say hello. "The county is threatening me with criminal charges over algae treatment." I felt a cold sort of satisfaction. "You dumped chemicals in my pond after I told you not to, Patricia. What did you think was going to happen?" "It was just algicide. You're acting like I poured toxic waste in there." "It turns out my pond feeds the county's aquifer. You contaminated drinking water for 15,000 people. So yeah, Patricia, it's a big deal." There was stunned silence on the other end. "That's not possible. It's just a pond." "Tell that to the Department of Environmental Quality. They're testing the water right now, and they want to know exactly what you dumped and how much." I'm not telling them anything without a lawyer. That's probably smart, I said. You're going to need one. She hung up. The rest of the week was a blur. The county issued a precautionary advisory for residents in the affected area to use bottled water until further notice. The story made regional news, and then it hit the national news cycle when environmental groups picked it up as an example of HOA overreach causing ecological damage. I gave several interviews, always careful to stick to the facts. The HOA president had trespassed on my property and dumped chemicals into a natural pond that fed the public water supply, despite my explicit objections. The HOA board tried to distance themselves from Patricia, issuing a statement saying she'd acted on her own and that the board hadn't authorized any chemical treatment of private property. Several of my neighbors came by to express support. A guy named Tom from 2 streets over told me that Patricia had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years with petty violations and that it was about time someone stood up to her. Amanda Vincent filed a lawsuit against both Patricia Hendricks and the Pine Valley Estates HOA for trespassing, property damage, and emotional distress. We were seeking compensatory damages for the loss of use of my pond, the death of wildlife, and the cost of remediation. We also filed for punitive damages based on Patricia's willful disregard for my property rights and the environmental consequences of her actions. The county's investigation revealed that Patricia had purchased 60 gallons of industrial-strength algicide from a commercial supplier, claiming it was for a golf course pond. She dumped approximately 15 gallons into my pond, which was roughly 50 times the recommended concentration for a body of water that size. The copper sulfate levels were so high that they'd killed not just the algae, but virtually every living thing in the pond within 48 hours. David Chen testified at a preliminary hearing that the contamination had reached the aquifer and that trace amounts of copper had been detected at downstream monitoring wells. Fortunately, the levels were still below the EPA's action threshold for drinking water, and the natural filtration through limestone bedrock was helping to remediate the contamination. However, the county had to spend over $200,000 on emergency testing, monitoring, and bottled water distribution. In late July, the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality filed criminal charges against Patricia Hendricks. She was charged with 3 misdemeanor violations of the State Water Quality Act and 1 felony count of recklessly endangering public health. The felony charge carried a potential sentence of up to 3 years in prison. The preliminary hearing was held in early August at the Buncombe County Courthouse. I attended, sitting in the gallery with Amanda beside me. Patricia showed up with a lawyer, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who spent most of his time whispering urgently to his client. The prosecutor, an assistant district attorney named Michael Lawson, presented the evidence methodically. He showed photos of the pond before and after the contamination. He presented the water quality test results. He had Officer Ramirez testify about responding to the trespassing call. David Chen testified about the aquifer connection and the public health risk. And then he had me testify. I described the events of that day, how Patricia had shown up uninvited, how I'd explicitly told her not to put anything in the pond, and how she'd done it anyway while laughing at my concerns. I explained that I'd called the police and that I'd had no idea the pond was connected to the public water supply until the county informed me. Patricia's lawyer tried to make the case that his client had been acting in good faith to maintain community standards and that she couldn't have known about the aquifer connection. But the prosecutor pointed out that ignorance of environmental law wasn't a defense, especially when the defendant had been explicitly told not to proceed by the property owner. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Morrison, reviewed the evidence and determined there was sufficient probable cause to proceed to trial on all charges. She set a trial date for October and addressed Patricia directly. "Ms. Hendricks, I want to be very clear about something," Judge Morrison said. "The right of a homeowners association to enforce aesthetic standards does not extend to trespassing on private property or introducing contaminants into the environment. If these allegations are proven at trial, you'll be facing serious consequences. I strongly suggest you consider the offer the prosecutor is going to make you." Patricia looked like she'd aged 10 years since I'd last seen her. She nodded silently. Meanwhile, the civil suit was progressing. During discovery, we learned some interesting things. First, the HOA's insurance policy explicitly excluded coverage for intentional acts of board members. That meant if we won the lawsuit, Patricia would be personally liable for damages. Second, the HOA board had actually voted against taking any action on my pond during a meeting Patricia had failed to mention. She'd acted entirely on her own against the board's decision. Several current and former HOA members provided depositions describing Patricia's pattern of overstepping her authority. One woman testified that Patricia had tried to have her fined for planting the wrong color roses. A man described how Patricia had reported him to code enforcement for parking his work van in his own driveway. The picture that emerged was of someone who treated the HOA presidency as a personal fiefdom. In September, Patricia's criminal lawyer reached out to the prosecutor to discuss a plea deal. The details were hammered out over several weeks. Patricia would plead guilty to 1 count of reckless endangerment of public health, a reduced felony, and 2 misdemeanor violations of water quality standards. In exchange, the prosecutor would recommend a suspended sentence with probation, community service, and full restitution to the county for remediation costs. The plea hearing was scheduled for late September. This time, I sat in the front row. Amanda had explained that the criminal case resolution would likely influence the civil case settlement negotiations. Patricia stood before Judge Morrison and admitted in a shaky voice that she had trespassed on my property and introduced chemicals into a pond connected to the public water supply without authorization, knowing that I had objected to her actions. She acknowledged that her actions had required the county to spend significant resources protecting public health. Judge Morrison accepted the plea and imposed the sentence. Patricia received 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service focused on environmental education, and was ordered to pay $215,000 in restitution to Buncombe County. The judge also imposed a special condition. Patricia had to resign from the HOA board immediately and was prohibited from serving in any HOA leadership position for the duration of her probation. "Ms. Hendricks," Judge Morrison said, "you abused a position of trust in your community and showed a shocking disregard for both private property rights and public safety. You're fortunate that the contamination didn't result in anyone becoming seriously ill. This court takes environmental crimes very seriously, and I want you to understand that you came very close to serving time in prison. If you violate the terms of your probation in any way, you will serve the maximum sentence. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Patricia whispered. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been delivered with a side of recognition that what Patricia did was genuinely dangerous and wrong. With the criminal case resolved, settlement talks in the civil suit accelerated. Patricia's lawyer made it clear that his client was essentially judgment-proof after having to pay the restitution to the county. Most of her savings were going to be wiped out. However, the HOA's insurance company, despite the exclusion for intentional acts, was worried about the bad publicity and potential liability for inadequate oversight of their board president. After several rounds of negotiation, we reached a settlement in mid-October. The HOA's insurance company paid me $150,000 to cover the pond remediation, loss of enjoyment of my property, attorney's fees, and general damages. Patricia personally paid an additional $25,000, which was everything she had left after the restitution payment. The HOA also agreed to amend its covenants to explicitly exclude natural water features from HOA oversight and to implement mandatory training for all board members on property rights and environmental regulations. The pond cleanup took most of October and November. The county environmental team pumped out the contaminated water, removed several inches of contaminated sediment from the pond bottom, and then allowed the springs to naturally refill the pond. They tested the water weekly, and by early December, David Chen confirmed that the water quality had returned to pre-contamination levels. "It's going to take a while for the ecosystem to fully recover," he told me during his final site visit. "But the good news is that spring water is incredibly clean and life is resilient. You should start seeing frogs again by next spring, and the aquatic plants will recolonize on their own." He was right. When spring arrived the following year, I heard the first peepers calling from the pond's edge. By May, tadpoles were swarming in the shallows, and dragonflies had returned. A great blue heron took up residence, stopping by most mornings for breakfast. Native water lilies began growing along the far bank. The pond was healing. The HOA had also undergone a transformation. With Patricia gone, new leadership had taken over. The new president, a retired teacher named Roger, had a much more reasonable approach to governance. One of his first acts was to send a personal apology letter to me on behalf of the HOA, acknowledging that I'd been wronged and thanking me for my patience during the remediation process. The story had a strange cultural afterlife. Environmental law professors started using the case as a teaching example. An article in an HOA management journal titled "When Board Members Go Rogue" featured my story prominently. I even got a call from someone producing a documentary about HOA overreach, though I politely declined to participate. I'd had enough publicity. On a warm Saturday afternoon in June, almost exactly a year after Patricia had contaminated my pond, I was sitting on my back deck with a beer, watching the evening light play across the water. My girlfriend Sarah, who I'd started dating a few months earlier, was beside me. She taught environmental science at a local high school and had been fascinated by the whole saga. "You know what's wild?" she said, watching a heron stalk through the shallows. "If Patricia had just left your pond alone, none of this would have happened. A little algae is completely natural. She destroyed her life over essentially nothing." "She destroyed her life because she couldn't stand that someone told her no," I said. "The algae was just an excuse. It was about control." Sarah nodded. "I'm using your story in my class next year when we talk about watershed management and aquifer protection. It's a perfect example of how everything in an ecosystem is connected. You can't just dump chemicals somewhere and assume there won't be consequences. And you can't run an HOA like a dictatorship and assume there won't be legal consequences," I added. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening chorus of frogs. The pond had become even more beautiful after its recovery, if that was possible. Knowing that it was connected to something larger, that the water flowing through my backyard eventually made its way to thousands of people's homes, made me feel like I was part of something important. I'd learned a lot over the past year. I'd learned about aquifer recharge zones and water quality standards. I'd learned about environmental law and HOA governance, but mostly I'd learned that standing up for your rights, even when it seems easier to just go along, is important not just for yourself, but for everyone who might be affected. Patricia, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine, had moved to a condo in another county. She was working as a receptionist and spending her weekends fulfilling her community service hours by giving talks at schools about environmental responsibility. I had mixed feelings about her fate. Part of me felt she'd gotten what she deserved. Part of me just felt sad that someone had been so consumed by the need to control others that she'd destroyed her own life. The Pine Valley Estates, HOA, continued to function, but with a much lighter touch. The new board had reduced the number of restrictions, focusing only on issues that genuinely affected property values or safety. There were no more complaints about algae, wrong-colored roses, or work vans in driveways. Turns out, when you treat people like adults capable of managing their own properties, most of them do just fine. One unexpected benefit of the whole disaster was that the county had updated its regulations regarding private ponds that connect to aquifer systems. Now, properties like mine had to be registered with the environmental office, and owners received information about protecting water quality. It wasn't burdensome, just common-sense guidelines about not using certain chemicals, maintaining natural buffer zones, and reporting any suspected contamination immediately. The program was named the Oak Creek Aquifer Protection Initiative, and I'd been asked to serve on the advisory committee. On the legal front, Amanda Vincent had become something of a local celebrity in environmental law circles. She'd used the publicity from my case to build a practice focused on property rights and environmental protection. She sent me a nice bottle of whiskey when the case settled, along with a note saying it had been a pleasure working with someone who cared about doing the right thing. As summer deepened, I installed some native plants around the pond's perimeter based on recommendations from the county naturalist. Cardinal flowers, swamp milkweed, and blue flag iris now provided habitat for pollinators and helped filter any runoff before it reached the water. Sarah helped me build a small observation platform where we could sit and watch the wildlife without disturbing them. One evening in late July, Tom from down the street stopped by with a six-pack. We sat on the deck and he told me that property values in Pine Valley Estates had actually increased since the HOA had backed off on aggressive enforcement. People wanted to live in a community where they had some freedom and where the leadership was reasonable. "You did us all a favor, man," Tom said, raising his beer. "Patricia was making this place miserable. Now it actually feels like a neighborhood instead of a minimum security prison." I clinked my bottle against his. I just wanted to keep my pond clean. I never intended to start a revolution. "Sometimes revolutions start because one person says enough is enough," Tom said. "You stood up to her when the rest of us were too tired or too scared of the fines. That mattered." As the sun set and the fireflies began their nightly dance over the pond, I reflected on the journey. It had been stressful, expensive even with the settlement, and at times genuinely frightening. When you're told that your property is connected to the drinking water for 15,000 people and someone's contaminated it, that's the stuff of nightmares. But we'd gotten through it. The pond was healthy, the aquifer was safe, and the community was better for having gone through the process of holding someone accountable. I thought about writing a post on one of those HOA horror story forums, but I decided against it. I'd told the story enough times to reporters, lawyers, and curious neighbors. What mattered now was moving forward and enjoying the property I'd fought to protect. Sarah and I started planning a small pond warming party for late August, inviting the neighbors who'd supported me, the county environmental team who'd worked so hard on the remediation, and the new HOA board members who were trying to do things right. It felt important to celebrate not just the recovery of the pond, but the recovery of community trust and reasonable governance. The invitations went out, and the response was overwhelming. People wanted to come, to see the pond that had been the center of so much drama, and to celebrate what felt like a victory for common sense. David Chen from the county wrote back saying he wouldn't miss it for the world and that he was bringing his kids because he wanted them to see a successful remediation story. Planning the party gave me something positive to focus on. Sarah and I made a menu featuring local foods and drinks. I rented tables and chairs. The new HOA president, Roger, even offered to have the HOA sponsor some of the costs as a gesture of goodwill, though I politely declined. This wasn't an HOA event, it was a community gathering, and I wanted to keep it separate from organizational politics. The day of the party arrived with perfect weather, sunny, low humidity, and a gentle breeze that kept the temperature comfortable. Guests started arriving around noon, and soon my backyard was full of people laughing, eating, and admiring the pond. The kids in attendance were particularly excited about the tadpoles and water striders. David Chen gave an impromptu talk about aquifer systems and why protecting them matters. He explained how the spring water in my pond eventually makes its way through underground limestone channels to the wells that supply drinking water to schools, hospitals, and homes. The kids listened, fascinated, and several asked questions that David answered with obvious enthusiasm. "This pond," he said, gesturing toward the water, "is a reminder that we're all connected through water. What happens in one person's backyard can affect thousands of people downstream. That's why we have environmental regulations, and that's why it matters that we enforce them." One of the guests, a woman I didn't know well, asked me how I'd felt when I first learned the pond was connected to the aquifer. I thought about it for a moment before answering. Honestly, I was terrified, I admitted. I'd been living here for months, doing normal yard work, not knowing that what I did could potentially affect so many people. It was a huge responsibility I hadn't asked for, but then I realized that's true for all of us in different ways. We all have impacts we don't think about. The difference is whether we're willing to take that responsibility seriously when we learn about it. The party stretched into the evening. As the sun began to set, someone suggested we release some native fish into the pond to help complete the ecosystem recovery. David thought it was a great idea and said he'd coordinate with the State Wildlife Resources Commission to get appropriate species. That led to a discussion about maybe installing a small fishing pier for catch and release fishing, which several of the neighbors' kids got very excited about. When the last guest left around 9 o'clock, Sarah and I collapsed onto the deck chairs, exhausted but happy. The yard was a mess of cups and plates, but we'd deal with that in the morning. For now, we just sat and listened to the pond's nighttime symphony. That was good, Sarah said. People needed that. Not just you, but everyone. After all the stress and conflict, they needed to see that things could be okay again. She was right. The party had been less about celebrating my personal victory and more about the community coming together around something positive. It was a declaration that we could move past the dysfunction Patricia had created and build something better. In the following weeks, life settled into a comfortable routine. I worked from my home office, took breaks to walk around the pond, and generally enjoyed the peace I'd fought so hard to protect. The legal saga became a story I told at dinner parties, edited down to the highlights, always ending with the observation that you should never underestimate the determination of an HOA Karren with a chip on her shoulder. The county sent me an official letter in September, thanking me for my cooperation during the investigation and remediation process. They also sent a certificate designating my property as a registered Aquifer protection site, which came with a small engraved plaque I installed near the pond's edge. It read, "Oak Creek Aquifer Protection Site. This natural spring feeds the regional water supply. Help us protect it." I ran into Patricia once, completely by accident, at a grocery store in October. We saw each other from opposite ends of an aisle, and for a moment I thought she might just turn around and leave. Instead, she pushed her cart forward until we were a few feet apart. "Marcus," she said quietly. She looked tired, older, diminished somehow. "Patricia," I replied, not sure what else to say. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to talk to, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I was wrong. About everything. I let the power of that stupid HOA position go to my head, and I hurt you and a lot of other people. I'm paying for it now, but that doesn't undo what I did." I studied her face, looking for any sign of insincerity, but all I saw was genuine remorse. "I appreciate you saying that," I told her. "I hope you're able to rebuild your life." "I'm trying. The community service has actually been good for me. Teaching kids about protecting the environment, learning about ecology and water systems, it's made me realize how much I didn't know and how careless I was." She paused. "Your pond? Is it recovering?" "It is. Slowly, but yes, the springs are doing their job." She nodded. "That's good. That's really good." She started to push her cart past me, then stopped. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you stood up to me. Someone needed to." I watched her walk away, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Anger at what she'd done, sympathy for what she was going through, and a kind of closure I hadn't expected to get. She'd acknowledged her wrongs, and while that didn't erase the damage, it did make it easier to let go of the anger I'd been carrying. When I got home and told Sarah about the encounter, she had an interesting perspective. "People can change," she said. "Not everyone does, and sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to make it happen, but it's possible. Maybe the Patricia who apologized to you today isn't the same person who dumped chemicals in your pond. Maybe losing everything taught her something." "Maybe," I agreed. "I hope so, for her sake. But I'm also glad there are consequences for people who abuse power, even small-time power like running an HOA. Otherwise, nothing ever changes." As autumn progressed and the leaves around the pond turned brilliant shades of red and gold, I found myself reflecting on the concept of stewardship. That's what David Chen had called it during his talk at the party, the idea that we don't really own the land we live on so much as we're temporary caretakers of it. The pond had been here long before me and would be here long after I was gone, feeding the aquifer, supporting life, being part of something larger than any individual property claim. Understanding that changed how I thought about the place. I was more careful about what products I used in the yard, more thoughtful about maintaining the natural buffer zones around the water. I even started a small project to remove some invasive plants that were creeping in from the neighbor's property, replacing them with natives that better supported local wildlife. The HOA, under new leadership, embraced this philosophy too, They started a community garden using sustainable practices, organized neighborhood cleanups that focused on proper disposal of chemicals and yard waste, and even brought in speakers to talk about environmental stewardship and property values. It turned out that marketing the community as eco-conscious and environmentally responsible actually attracted buyers and improved the neighborhood's reputation. In November, I received notification that Patricia had completed 200 hours of her community service and that the feedback from her supervisors was excellent. She was apparently taking the requirements seriously, developing presentations about watershed protection that she delivered at schools throughout the county. The program coordinator sent me a copy of her evaluation, noting that she'd become one of their most effective speakers because she was willing to talk about her own mistakes. I didn't know what to do with that information. Part of me wanted to maintain my anger, to see her as the villain in my story. But another part recognized that she was doing the work, making amends in the way the court had ordered, and apparently changing as a person. Life isn't as simple as the stories we tell ourselves, I realized. People are complicated, and sometimes the antagonist in one chapter becomes something else in the next. December brought the first snow, and the pond took on a magical quality with ice crystals forming along its edges and snow dusting the surrounding pines. Sarah and I spent Christmas Day there, drinking hot chocolate and watching the wildlife. Even in winter, the pond was alive. Birds came to drink from the open water near the springs where it didn't freeze. Deer tracks crisscrossed the snow around the banks. Life persisted. As the year came to a close, I found myself taking stock. 12 months earlier, I'd been an ordinary guy with a pond who'd gotten into an extraordinary conflict. Now I was a registered Aquifer protection site manager, an environmental law case study, and a minor celebrity in HOA reform circles. It hadn't been the year I'd planned, but it had been meaningful. The settlement money had covered my legal fees with enough left over that I'd put a significant chunk into savings. The pond cleanup had been entirely funded by the county and Patricia's restitution, so my property was actually in better shape than before the incident. The community around me had transformed from a place run by petty tyranny to a genuine neighborhood where people looked out for each other. And I'd learned that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate situation. On New Year's Eve, Sarah and I stood on the deck as midnight approached, listening to distant fireworks and watching the pond reflect starlight. "Resolution time," she said. "What's yours?" I thought about it. I want to stay engaged, I decided. With the Aquifer Protection Committee, with the community, with taking care of this place. I want to honor the responsibility that comes with living here. "That's a good one," Sarah said. She leaned against me as we counted down to midnight, and when we reached 0 and kissed, I felt genuinely optimistic about the future. The new year brought new challenges, as years do, but none that matched the drama of the previous one. The Aquifer Committee met monthly, discussing water quality monitoring, public education, and conservation strategies. I discovered I actually enjoyed the work. It felt good to be part of something that mattered, to help protect a resource that thousands of people depended on. In February, the HOA held its annual meeting. I attended, curious to see how things were being run under the new leadership. Roger, the president, gave a report that was refreshingly focused on genuine community needs: road maintenance, common area landscaping, and managing the neighborhood entrance. There was no mention of enforcement actions, no threats of fines, no discussions of aesthetic violations. When someone brought up a neighbor's mailbox that was leaning slightly, Roger's response was, "Maybe we should offer to help them fix it." The contrast with Patricia's reign was stark. This was what an HOA was supposed to be: neighbors helping neighbors, not an enforcement body looking for violations. Several people thanked Roger and the board for their approach, and there was genuine warmth in the room. Community had been restored. I gave a brief update on the pond and the aquifer protection work, thanking the county for their remediation efforts and explaining the new registration program. I also mentioned that David Chen had said any other properties with natural water features were welcome to contact him about registration and best practices. A couple of hands went up, people who had small streams or springs on their property and wanted to make sure they were doing right by them. After the meeting, a man approached me with an extended hand and a grin. "Thank you for what you did," he said. My wife and I almost didn't buy here because of all the restrictive covenants. We came back after hearing that things had changed. Best decision we made. That sentiment, more than anything else, confirmed that the fight had been worth it. People wanted to live in places where they were trusted and respected, not controlled and micromanaged. The outcome had made Pine Valley Estates a better community, and that benefit extended to everyone who lived there or would live there in the future. As winter gave way to spring, the pond truly came back to life. The frogs returned in force, their evening chorus loud enough to hear from inside the house. Native plants burst into bloom along the banks. A family of ducks took up residence for a few weeks before moving on. The great blue heron became a regular fixture, so comfortable that it would fish even when I was sitting on the deck watching. David Chen came by in early April to do a one-year post-remediation assessment. He spent an hour taking water samples and checking various ecological indicators. When he finished, he was smiling. "Oh, je fais das." "This is remarkable," he said, showing me his test results. "The water quality is actually better than our baseline from before the contamination. The cleanup gave us a chance to remove some built-up sediment, and the aquatic ecosystem has bounced back stronger. This is a best-case outcome." "So the aquifer is safe?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "The aquifer is safe," he confirmed. "Trace elements of the contamination are essentially undetectable at this point, well below any threshold of concern. The natural filtration and dilution did their job, and the spring flow has essentially flushed the system. You've got a healthy pond feeding a healthy aquifer." We shook hands, and he thanked me again for my cooperation during the crisis. "Most people would have been angry and uncooperative," he said. "You understood the bigger picture. That made all the difference in how smoothly the remediation went." After he left, I sat by the pond for a long time, processing everything that had happened since that afternoon when Patricia had marched across my lawn with her chemical containers. The journey from that moment to this one had been stressful, expensive, and emotionally draining, but it had also been transformative. I'd learned about aquifer systems and environmental law. I'd met people like David Chen and Amanda Vincent who were passionate about protecting natural resources. I'd discovered that my community was capable of changing for the better when pushed to confront dysfunction. Most importantly, I'd learned that individual actions matter. Patricia's decision to dump chemicals had consequences that rippled out through the community, threatening public health and costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. My decision to stand up to her, to document what happened, and to pursue accountability had consequences too. It removed someone who was abusing power, it improved HOA governance, it raised awareness about aquifer protection, and it created legal precedents that might protect others in similar situations. We like to think we're isolated, that what we do on our own property only affects us, but that's an illusion. We're all connected through water, through air, through the social structures we create. The question is whether we're going to be good neighbors and good stewards, or whether we're going to prioritize our own desires over the common good. Patricia had chosen the latter path, at least initially. It had cost her almost everything. But even there, the story was more complex than simple punishment. She was rebuilding, learning, trying to make amends through service. That was its own kind of accountability, perhaps more meaningful than just paying fines or serving time. As spring deepened into summer, life at the pond settled into a peaceful rhythm. Sarah moved in with me in June, and we spent evenings on the deck planning our future. We talked about maybe getting married, about kids someday playing by the water, about growing old in this place we'd fought to protect. The pond was our witness, constant and serene, flowing steadily toward the aquifer that sustained so many lives. On the anniversary of the contamination incident, Sarah suggested we mark the occasion somehow. We decided to plant a tree, a native oak that would grow beside the pond for decades, maybe centuries. As we dug the hole and settled the young tree into the earth, I thought about what it represented. Growth, recovery, roots going deep, branches reaching up, life persisting despite setbacks. "To second chances," Sarah said, patting soil around the tree's base. "To second chances," I echoed, "and to standing up for what matters. The oak would grow, the pond would flow, the aquifer would sustain the community, and life would go on." The drama with Patricia and the HOA had become part of the past, a story we told but no longer lived in. The future was open, full of possibility, rooted in the lessons we'd learned and the choices we'd made. That evening, as we sat by the water and watched the first stars appear, I felt profound gratitude. Not for the conflict or the stress, but for the understanding it had brought about how things are connected, about what matters, about the importance of standing up for your rights and the rights of others. The pond had taught me lessons about ecology, but the experience had taught me lessons about community, justice, and the long arc toward accountability. The great blue heron landed in the shallows with a soft splash, beginning its evening hunt. Frogs called from the banks, stars reflected on the dark water, and somewhere deep below, spring water flowed steadily toward the aquifer, clean and clear, sustaining life in ways both seen and unseen. Everything was connected, everything mattered, and I was exactly where I needed to be.